We have just three presentations. So Amanda, Jessica, yeah, and Susannah. So if I can give Ananda the word. Thank you.
I should have Diane's slides, actually, and then we just swap. Okay, hi, I'm Ananda Rutherford, and I'm a research fellow at the University of Arts in London on a project at the moment, and the reflections I'm presenting today have developed during the Transforming Collections, Reimagining Art, Nation and Heritage project as part of the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council's 5-year funding initiative towards the National Collections. That's all my official stuff out of the way. TANK, as it's referred to for the brief period of its life, which is coming to an end right now, has supported research that seeks to address the barriers that exist within and between the UK's cultural heritage collections, with the aim of opening them up to new research opportunities and encouraging the public to explore them in new ways. Our project, Transforming Collections, is underpinned by the belief that this national collection cannot be imagined without addressing structural inequalities and systematic biases in the arts. And my research in particular references collections records, information, and data. The ambition of the project was to combine critical art historical and museological research with participatory interactive machine learning design to evidence and surface suppressed histories, amplify marginalized voices, and re-evaluate artists and artworks ignored or sidelined by traditional narratives. Oh, sorry, this is more partners. Collaborating with a range of UK public art collections and archives, our diverse team of art historians and museum professionals have worked closely with creative computing technologists to develop an interactive machine learning tool to support critical analysis of collections, but with the aim of ensuring the technology was shaped to challenge, complicate, and enrich existing collections data. However, in this talk, I'm not going to elaborate on the details of the tool or the tech itself, but rather focus on our approaches and understandings at the intersection of technology and cultural heritage information. There are two crucial aspects to this work which have required careful navigation. The first being the hugely accelerated pace of change in relation to generative AI. In terms of development, the last year's been insane. Fantasy solutionism, doomerism, real-world application, and the hyperbole of media debates. The second, perhaps more prosaically, is grappling with how we in the museum sector understand art and humanities knowledge and information as data, and how we might usefully engage with these increasingly ubiquitous technologies. This has entailed not only practicalities of understanding what constitutes a data set and how it might be used, and grappling with the intricacies of using algorithms and statistical models to analyze and draw inferences from patterns in data, but also developing the capacity to think critically about what happens in the process, what value, if any, is added, the potential for flattening out nuance, the reductionism of big data solutions, and the dislocation from people and sources. To give a bit of context for my focus within the project, we need to start with the premise that's already been articulated this morning, that in recent years there has been much greater scrutiny of collections information and collections management practices in the GLAM sectors, especially around the persistence of cataloguing language and organisational conventions that repeat and codify colonial Eurocentric epistemologies, hierarchies, and notions of cultural capital. At the same time, these challenges to the assumed authority and objectivity of museums and galleries and the knowledge they present have occurred alongside large-scale digitisation over the last 20 years and the subsequent datification of GLAM collections. For those in computer science and digital humanities, GLAM collections appear to provide a wealth of images and a treasure trove of data that can be infinitely tested, explored, analysed, and reconfigured, and we saw that yesterday. But it's crucial to consider how GLAM information is produced and interpreted, and how this understanding changes with the project of cultural heritage digitisation and the advent of data analytics and machine learning at scale. The language and purview of discrimination and white supremacy persists in the records and labels. It's been exposed by digitization, but at the same time, this authoritative, epistemically colonial, institutionally sanctioned information has been repeated, codified, and amplified through online publication, and now the ubiquitous chatbots of generative AI. There are millions of texts, archival records, and labels to be dealt with. Recognition of these issues, combined with the advent and perpetual discussion about the benefits of machine learning and LLMs, inevitably begs questions around finding AI solutions. How can or should this massive information be expediently addressed? And can machine learning help to improve the museum gallery's contribution to the cultural digital record? Can we leverage the affordances of technology and machine learning to address structural inequality and systemized bias within art historical and museological practice? To address these questions, I attempted to compare editorial efforts within Tate to reappraise a set of artwork descriptions through an anti-racist lens, with the potential of machine learning assisted models developed during the project. So these things were going on at the same time. So that's the old from the landing page for the Tate. They've actually redone it because people keep changing things on websites. So even what I'm going to talk about in terms of the division of how information was presented has now changed. So I'm already out of date. I've been looking at a really small data set, just 244 texts describing 216 unique artworks. This group of online object description texts from Tate were identified as biased or potentially problematic in terms of language and content. In 2020 to 2021, the captions, summaries, and catalogue entries, that's the way they divide up their information, published as part of their online collections database, Art and Artists, went through a carefully documented and internal process of editing and amendment to identify contentious, racist, sexist, and otherwise discriminatory language and attitudes. I only had access to the texts as they were then presented online. Interestingly, some of them have now gone completely, so there's a sort of things that are happening under the bonnet, and others have been changed unrecognisably. The interface and organisation has, so just to confirm that the interface and organisation of the data has been changed. So where to start translating a mess of issues in content and context into a data set that can be trained and tested? As the locals in the room will know, Words Matter, a 2018 project from the National Museum of World Cultures Consortium, is one of the best and best known analysis of the prevalence of racism in museums and object interpretation, and has done much to challenge the way in which collections have traditionally been described. In particular, Hodan Wasame's essay, Mechanisms and Tropes of Colonial Narratives, describes a set of conventions and characterizations that help to articulate and identify the insidious language of white supremacy in object description. So Wasame provides a 5-point schema categorizing these figures of speech found in written texts describing art and artifacts, in what is still problematically referred to as ethnographic collections. I was interested to see if the tropes identified by Wasame were more broadly applicable or useful in looking at different types of collections, in this case the Tate's Fine Art collection. And further, for the Transforming Collections project, could this type of analysis be useful as a model for machine learning to identify such conventions and assist in the problematization of museum records at scale? If museum practice needs to move beyond the find and replace of pejorative words, can we prompt anti-racist criticality? Can a machine learning model make the words matter and scaffold critical thinking in cataloguing practice? And further, can machine learning tools surface the bias we may choose not to see? So I'm just going to show you the kind of insidious, so if you can just have a look at that. It's not obvious and it's difficult to apply pattern to. So even in trying to describe this, the bold is mine, and I don't think these labels are now up. They're from a variety of sources. But it presents a particular perspective that just sails along being fine, that quite often people don't actually even engage with. So I began my analysis of these texts using Wasame's tropes to categorize or rather code the issues present in them. But it became apparent that the specificity of Wasame's work in so-called ethnographic collections did not always fit the conventions of art historical or curatorial writing. The disciplinary distinction, that is, art history for us, ethnography for them, in the traditional conventions of writing in racism to the catalogues, provides another layer of structural complexity to any computational modelling attempted to write it out. The example here shows the variety of ways in which colonialist and white-centric approaches a colonialist and white-centric approach casually denigrates a culture and nation. So I reviewed the take, caption, summary, and catalogue texts again to identify a set of categories that emerged from the descriptive texts themselves. This more inductive or grounded approach served to capture not only the racism in the text, but to reveal the conventions of the British colonialist perspectives in art history. Just to note, these categories are my characterization from the text rather than anything that the tape was providing. And they're overt and covert examples of racism and bias from the texts. Sorry. My original intention with this research was to present a three-part comparison between the entirely human editorial process, dealing with issues in problematic language, and a white-centered perspective flagged by staff, the organisation, the public, and other stakeholders. Tate always has an email address, if you know something about this. Do tell us why it's wrong, interesting, what do you know more about? So some of the commentary about flagging the works of art came from the public, or experts, or not that the public can't be experts, I'm going to stop. Before I get in a muddle. And to contrast that editing process with a more structured and systematic inductive evaluation using qualitative analysis methodologies, and against the capacity of the interactive machine learning tool we were developing. However, this approach was only going to take the work so far, and that became evident quite early on, and it repeated the limitations of text as pattern, recognizing and potentially producing more text as pattern, but not the insights we were after. Reviewing both the information content and the captions against the tropes described by Wasame, and the entrenched and habitual disciplinary approaches that emerged in my own analysis revealed subjectivity, variability, and the need for deep contextual understanding of writing conventions, the artwork itself and its place as both document and source, the temporal specificity of the work and the texts, and inevitably the racial bias structurally and colonially deployed. There were layers upon layers of contextual, institutional, historical, and socio-political specificity through the language used, replaced, challenged, and changed. And what of the discrepancies between textual content and visual content? What is actually depicted, intended, interpreted in the work itself that is not actually addressed in the text? This exploration of classification and practice raised numerous questions. For example, how do we read quotations from artists differently from quotations from legacy catalogue texts or past curators informed by artist statements? And how would machine learning, so it's a complex one, I have to draw it one day, how would machine learning navigate these levels of nuance? The findings from this analysis, before or in parallel with the development of the interactive ML component, highlight the complexity of this work. The subjectivities, disciplinary specifics, temporal situatedness of any text are tricky to unpick, even with apparent subject expertise, lived experience, and subject knowledge. I would argue that context cannot be recreated from text as data or pattern without a complex understanding of interpretation, intent, positionality, and meaning. So I think I'm running out of time, so these are 5 areas that I identified a while back on a different project, and it occurred to me that they were the same concerns. I was applying them to what the problems with cataloguing texts were, so the language we use, it is the words, but it's much more than the words. There's also subject and content, which is what and who we choose to write about. I was struck in several of the presentations over the last few days about what people think of as their star objects, or their top 10, or their key presentations that represent them. Who and what are we presenting when we do that, and when we catalogue towards that? There's also knowledge, which is creation and production. It needs to consider who is involved, who is listened to, who can get access to the information, objects, and archives, and who is allowed to use the material, who participates in knowledge generation. These questions apply equally, those last 3, to any critical analysis of machine learning or its application. There's also cataloguing practices and systems. We don't do a good enough job of saying, Who commissioned this? What did they commission? What do they use it for? How does it work in practice? When did they replace it? Because all of those things actually change the content as well as the structure, the organization, and how we think about things. And we need to do the same. We need to ask the same questions of AI and machine learning. And then there's context and history. Again, similar to thinking about all of this critically. How did we get here? Why does it work this way? I think we don't ask these questions. We are too willing to accept that if it works and does something that looks interesting, that is enough. We're not looking at the impact. We're not looking at the people it impacts. We're not looking at the labor behind it. And that's actually deeply problematic. So for the project itself, when we were engaging, we came up with 7 principles, which are largely similar and informed by those. But again, context, to keep in focus the who, how, what, and when of the information, the data sets, the applications, the software, the origins and history of the data we use, and the origins and history of the systems we use. Transparency, or I am going off transparency in discussion with colleagues, and I think it's about accountability. Full transparency is not necessarily desirable, but full accountability, why you made the decisions, is. There's also absence. We had to deal with the information that's not there, that doesn't make the point, that has never been recorded, that has been erased, which we kept finding with artists of colour in the UK. The lovely quote from Vern Harris that the archive is a sliver of a sliver of a sliver is not a new idea, but LLMs are too, and the internet is, however huge they may feel. Much of the world's experience and knowledge is simply missing from the records. And there's scale. We wanted to look at scale and value small, specific, situated data sets, which is essentially what most collections information is. And forgive me for the Smithsonians and the British Museums and the Metropolitans in the room, and the Rijksmuseum. They had millions up there as well, obviously. So you and your millions are not the majority. And within your collections, don't be distracted by the affordances of big data and statistical assumptions. We wanted to be cautious around generative AI. That was our last one. Sorry, I think I've got 2 more, actually. Replacing catalogue records, creating information based on patterning and past data was not the path we wanted to pursue. Above all, number 6, we wanted to avoid the hubris of technological solutionism. That is, the ambition is not to eradicate issues of bias, absence, and bad writing. They are part of the human condition. Sorry, I put bad writing in, that's for me. But to develop tools which facilitate and support critical thinking, close reading, and finding evidence. And lastly, reflexiveness at all stages, not just in the reflexive cycle of the design process, but what are we doing and why? What are the impacts of this, and should we be doing it? So I'm just going to end on this to say the most significant shift in our approach was to move from thinking about what machine learning and artificial intelligence could do for collections information, and instead to think about how the information, knowledge, and understanding of art history and museology could inform development of machine learning. How could the complex and sometimes niche questions of artistic intent, the insidious but hard to discern bias and historical context be addressed by artificial intelligence? Inspired by the work of Stephanie Dinkins, who I really would encourage you to look up, who in her 2021 installation on love and data asks, what does AI need from you? We need to think more and more carefully about what the GLAM sectors can offer AI beyond our flawed and biased data. So in conclusion, Wendy Chun stated in her 2021 book, Discriminating Data, Correlation, Neighborhoods, and the New Politics of Recognition, computers as future depend on computers as memory machines, on digital data as archives that are always there. This future depends on programmable visions that extrapolate the future, or more precisely, a future based on the past. This is evident in the construction and use of LLMs and the behaviors and products of generative AI applications. Additionally, much is made of the heterogeneous nature of museum data, how difficult it is, we've heard that many times, and that's how very hard it is to deal with in computational terms, both in terms of content and medium. At the same, I'm nearly done, my time is up. At the same time, there is also a pernicious homogeneity in the structural racism of historical object description that manifests in language, narratives, and the privileging or erasing of certain types of information to maintain the white supremacist status quo. So we must tread very carefully, navigating these homogeneous, heterogeneous texts and the reality of what human-designed tools can and might do with them. If we consider Chun's statement in terms of what actually happens with collections when they are remediated within what Nana Thalstrup calls the regime of cultural memory and Rupika Rissam refers to as the digital cultural record, we need to consider what relationship we should be crafting between machine learning and the histories of art as presented through the data we offer up, and to scrutinize carefully what we present for use and analysis. That is, the past we construct for the memory machines to remake into their seductive futures.
Hello. So my name is Jessica BrodeFrank, and today I'm going to talk to you about crowdsourcing AI and combining these methods. I'm currently on the faculty at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where I run the Chicago Collections Consortium, which is a group of 74 cultural heritage organizations in Chicago. And I'll be talking about time in a project at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. So when I began this research and work in 2019, I was increasingly aware of the difficulty in navigating cultural heritage collections online. Issues arose both externally when researchers, academics, corporations, and the general public were continually reaching out with specific content requests that they could not discover within our institutional catalogs online, but also internally where our own teams and coworkers were coming up against unreturned searches for items they knew to be in the collections. This experience led me to question why the process of discovery was so difficult when it came to cultural heritage institutions. In particular, it brought about additional questions of accessibility and representation. If cultural heritage collections are inaccessible even to our own staff, due to search terms used to describe them or the structure of our cataloging itself, how do our institutions fulfill the mission to be places that disseminate knowledge to the greater public? In response to this question, I found three major areas to focus on in this talk. The first being the fact that our main access to collections is often through our online catalogs. The second, that professional cataloging can actually cause a semantic gap to develop between professionally trained catalogers and a variety of users. And third, the need for digital literacy and algorithmic bias to now become the knowledge our institutions are focusing on disseminating to users. And I'm going to try and tackle each of these in turn. The problem is multifaceted. However, we can begin by looking at taking back-end cataloging systems and using these as the core for our public access to collections online. For institutions like archives, this can cause issues from the offset when best practices for cataloging are doing so at a collection level versus an item level, but online searches by non-archives trained users may not understand how to navigate something like a finding aid. Similarly, within libraries, as social media and image-based prevalence in sharing collections has made illustrations, plates, and graphics even more essential to our public access strategies, it's complicated by the fact that we catalog a book as a single entity, and we may miss the contextual value of individual illustrations or even a full-text index of the volume itself. However, let us also remember this is also complicated by the systems we have available to us as institutions, as well as the technical staff we have available. This is also within balancing increasing access points with also wanting to limit superfluous searches or overwhelming result lists that no one wants to scroll through. Unlike text-based forms of information, cultural heritage objects and images have not traditionally been described according to subject matter or context. As we've heard earlier in this conference, descriptions often focus on physicality. We're often cataloging things like who made a piece, what it's made of, what size it is, when it was made, and where it was made. And though that's useful, this tombstone information does not help when a person comes to query a database looking for objects that feature specific visual elements. For example, we've seen queries for rainbows and snow, or thematic elements like gay pride or Black history. When the searchability, usability, and findability of information on the internet is impacted by the way we describe things, for heritage collections, this description is most often our professional descriptive language created by catalogers that exists as part of our metadata. Working towards access for all to our collections requires a transparent semantic shift, from describing our object's physicality to describing the object's context. A particularly adept way to make this shift is to bring the public into the description process itself, engaging them with the pieces and expanding cataloging data so it is more representative to the public as a whole. But before I get into crowdsourcing, let's talk a little bit about why that searchability and language choice matters. Unreturned searches can affect many things, including trust in institutions, which has become more important as news cycles have discussed museum practices and responsibilities, often without an understanding or discussion of the scope of work our institutions are responsible for, or tackling issues like funding and priorities that often limit the depth to which staff can describe collections beyond basic metadata. Museums understand the importance of trust. The new definition that ICOM put forward of museums stresses a new aim for museums to facilitate diversity and sustainability, with the museum's mission and reason for being shifting from the previous definition's use of words like study to the new definition stating museums exist to be places for reflection and knowledge sharing. This subtle shift signals that the cultural heritage sector is moving away from the neutral position of privileged authority and towards a more level network of collaboration. So now, crowdsourcing has been tested and piloted in museums in some form for the last 15 to 20 years, starting with projects like the Steve Museum, the Smithsonian's transcription projects, and From the Page. There have been many projects that demonstrate the public's interest in interacting with collections in crowdsourcing projects. In recent years, projects have shifted, with dozens of projects conducted to show the various advantages of crowdsourcing, including the ability to create transparent processes that expose not only the choices that are made by museum catalogers, but also algorithms that dictate searches throughout users' experiences elsewhere online. These projects have spanned institutional types and sizes, from the Getty to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Library of Congress, and even the Adler Planetarium. And I'm going to use the Adler Planetarium as my example moving forward. The Adler Planetarium sits in Chicago, Illinois. It has about 70 staff members and is a collection of rare books, archival materials, as well as scientific instruments. Over the year that the Tag Along with Adler project ran, from March of 2021 to March of 2022, the project had almost 7,000 individual participants to the Zooniverse.org platform. 1,091 objects were included in the project, and volunteers created 322,993 new individual metadata tags for these objects. What we noted was that volunteers responded similarly across 3 different collection types. They generated on average 373 tags per image for our archival photographs, 361 tags per image for rare book illustrations, and 360 tags added for images of object collections. This indicated for us that the impetus to tag and the ability to tag various collection types housed within cultural heritage institutions was affected very little by collection type. Here's a way to visualize the importance of that user language being added to a catalog for enhanced discoverability. Each image shows the same photograph from the Adler's archival collection, with the left including the terms that were already included in the Adler catalog, and the right including the tags that were added by users of the Tag Along with Adler project. Not only do these images help to demonstrate a difference in how museum catalogers describe images, in this case at a collection level versus the actual image level, but also in the amount of access points that become added by crowdsourcing projects. Again, increasing discoverability within searching behaviors, but also within browsing. A survey was shared with participants of the project to gauge qualitative baselines on engagement. This qualitative data was essential when discussing crowdsourcing projects as a mission-centric participatory experience. This set of questions shown here, asked in the survey, was particularly helpful in gauging audience perspectives on things like trust and representation within collections. There's an opportunity for museums as a place with marked standing in the community. Our survey found 97% of our respondents thought museums were essential to their communities. And that can help foster discussions on searchability and discovery on the web at large. This survey showed that roughly 80% of our participants indicated they can find things easily online, but less than 20% of those same participants stated that they actually trust what they find online. And this mirrors findings of a larger digital literacy crisis I will hit on in a minute. As cultural heritage institutions look towards diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, it's imperative that this work includes steps to make digital resources more accessible online. And a crucial step is to make our digital resources, and in particular our digital images, accessible online with the inclusion of alt text and long descriptions. Alt text or alternative text is the textual substitute for non-textual content on web pages. And alt text serves multiple functions for online users with visual or cognitive disabilities. Up to 250 million people with vision impairment benefit from image descriptions, in addition to countless others with information processing differences such as dyslexia, for whom text-to-speech technologies provided by screen readers are critical, and alt text is critical for making that work. But even for non-disabled users, alt text can enhance the experience. If an image fails to load due to broadband or internet issues, or a particular user has blocked or disabled images within their browser, the inclusion of alternative text ensures that the browser is able to present the alternative text in place of that image. And furthermore, alt text is parsed by our search engines and is used in the assessment of pages for purpose and content, helping to increase search result propagation. Importantly, alternative text should not simply repeat caption information or even the catalog information. Instead, it should describe what a sighted visitor would see when they look at the image itself. And this is where metadata crowdsourcing projects, as described, can be seen further as an opportunity for the cultivation of alt text, as well as the enrichment of cataloging, both of which are labor-intensive and time-intensive. An interesting development within the Tag Along with Adler project was the continual inclusion of metadata tags added in full sentence structures describing images seen within the project. Within the tags added for the project across 11 incremental data releases in 12 months, about 5% of our tag submissions were continually done in these full syntax styles. Full sentence descriptions were added by volunteers, unprompted by the project team, and it's a truth in itself that alt text requires significant labor. But that's also a truth about cataloging. The implications of this specific research show the potential of crowdsourcing in describing subject or context of images within our cultural heritage institutions. And I would argue that the description can be used for both the expansion of cataloging terms and the creation of this alternative text. So just this year, the United States government released data on information literacy resources for library and museum professionals, recognizing on a national level the need to build information literacy within the population, including the skills needed to find, understand, evaluate, and share information. Informationliteracy.gov was launched in collaboration with the Institute of Museum and Library Services, releasing not only resources for professionals, but also a damning state of the community, showing that 1 in 5, or 20% of US adults are struggling with digital literacy today, mirroring the results we found in the Tag Along with Adler qualitative survey. IMLS has encouraged institutions to discuss algorithmic bias as well as artificial intelligence in increasing ways within our institutions. Now, the inclusion of AI tags in the Tag Along with Adler project actually predated this, but was specifically chosen to reflect the emerging projects in the sector within the last decade. Museums including the Met, the Barnes Foundation, MIT, Philadelphia Museum of Art, and Harvard Art Museums had all employed machine vision to analyze, categorize, and interpret their collections. AI also already underpins many routine aspects of our daily lives online. And part of the inclusion of AI tags within this project was to raise awareness with project participants about the ways these tags are instrumental to their daily search and discovery tasks, often in ways they don't realize. This was done by using 2 different AI models, one that was specifically trained on museum collections, which came from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and is called the IMET Tagger, and the other is the one that underpins Google image search, the Google Cloud Vision API. When processing data from the Tag Along with Adler projects, a comparison was made to denote how many tags were added by users that were already represented in Adler's catalog of professionally created metadata, and what was created previously by the 2 AI models versus how many of the tags were completely new. The average for tags added that were already in our catalog was 13.5%, and the average for tags added by users that was also created by AI models was 7%. Volunteers were asked to also perform not only this tagging task, but also a verification task. They were presented with 7,606 AI-generated metadata tags that were created from that collection of 1,091 Adler Planetarium objects. Now, roughly 2/3 of these terms were validated by volunteers, with 1/3 being left unvalidated. And despite accounting for 58% of the total tags generated, the Google Cloud Vision API tags actually accounted for almost 90% of the tags verified by volunteers, demonstrating there was a strong preference from our volunteers for the visually descriptive language of the Google Cloud Vision API versus the more museum cataloger language prevalent in the IMET Tagger. Now, reviewing the literature, it's evident that machine vision and AI tagging have become advanced enough to detect subject matter and objects depicted across various content types. And they've been used by various institutions already to expand and enrich existing metadata tags. And even our research found a strong validation rate for these tags, again, 66%. And that the workflows featuring AI received 3 times as much engagement as our non-AI workflows on the Zooniverse crowdsourcing platform. However, AI models are still limited in their ability to process complexity, and importantly, they're still trained by humans based on cataloging practices. The importance here is to recognize that by switching to a machine, the bias and semantic gap are not removed, but they're trained in. In the example shown here, the AI taggers added terms for scientists and doctors to the images on the left, but nurses for images on the right, despite the fact that both actually show Adler Planetarium astronomers at work. These comments came from the Zooniverse Talk Board, which is a chat functionality on the crowdsourcing platform. They demonstrate the interest that volunteers had in AI technology, but also the importance of addressing AI technology limitations with our guests. These comments help to demonstrate the need for institutions to really communicate about these emerging technologies with their audiences, as there is clearly a disconnect between the promises made by these technologies and the actual execution and limitations they currently have. AI is often spoken about as if it is a nebulous technological entity, oftentimes purposefully obscuring the fact that AI is contingent on the labor of people. The training models for AI, especially those in cultural heritage, rely on curated collections of often white, Eurocentric, and male-dominated narratives, and they're already shown to create algorithmic bias, causing ethical concerns for AI in regards to the transparency of model fairness. However, it's also imperative to discuss how this technology is built on the exploitation of labor within the AI industry. When building AI models off of the internet, companies like OpenAI rely on human labor, mostly sourced from the global south, to sort through the worst of what the internet has to offer in an attempt to create safeguards against racism, sexism, sexual assault, and more, paying human beings often less than $2 an hour to be exposed to the most abusive content of the web. Additionally, a 2024 report by NPR showed that greenhouse gas emissions have risen by almost 50% just at Google due to their use of generative AI, increasing the need for data center energy consumption. And a recent 2024 article from The Times showed the latest big tech sustainability reports showed double-digit increases in water consumption by Google, Microsoft, and Meta at an average of 20%. With millennial and Gen Z audiences prioritizing racial justice and climate change with 10 to 15% higher prioritization than the general public polled by the Slover Lynette Company in 2022, these discussions around AI are more important than ever. It's clear that the main purpose of metadata is to enable discoverability. And this prioritization of discovery means that metadata needs to be reflective and iterative in its service to discovery. Terminologies, language choices, and even context change over time, and therefore metadata should be able to reflect these changes. We barely have the time, we barely have the money to catalog as it is, but crowdsourcing of metadata tags was initially identified as a relatively cheap means of obtaining descriptive data and conducting these labor-intensive tasks. However, it is not cheap, and it is not lacking in labor intensiveness, but it does enhance findability, and it can become a major impetus for many crowdsourcing projects. And it's time to examine and consider projects like crowdsourcing as an extension of museums' mission-driven work, and see the value in including the voices of the public the museum serves in the work presented and done, while highlighting the laborious task of museum work. By considering these projects a part of the mission-centric work of the institution, it's possible to devote the staff, the time, and the resources needed to run these projects iteratively, continuously, and successfully. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I want to start this talk by saying, unfortunately, my partner cannot be here, so I will show two people at the end, and I'm doing my best to talk for two people, hopefully twice as fast. So today, we're going to talk about federated social networks and digital archives and how this can help to reshape engagement with cultural heritage. I'm excited to introduce to you a conceptual model for decolonizing collections, and I want to invite you during this talk to reflect on what is needed to build more inclusive and dynamic cultural heritage information systems. Okay, first a bit about digitalization. So I love this quote: digitalization can be understood as an intrinsic process of adding intense manipulation between machines and humans and adding layers of data to existing physical materials. So when a physical object is digitized, it's transformed into this new substance, information. And the separation of information from its physical form, it's a major shift with profound implications for the production, management, and engagement with cultural heritage. So objects in a digital form can be manipulated, they can be shared, they can be accessed globally, offering new ways for communities to connect with their heritage. However, this transformation also raises questions about what might be altered or lost when something becomes just data. It's crucial to recognize that heritage is not neutral, and neither is the technology that's used to digitize it. The process of digitalization is shaped by choices about what's preserved, what's presented, and who can access it. These choices are often influenced by cultural and institutional biases, which you've heard a lot about in the last hour, and can affect how heritage is documented and understood. So, thus, there's a lot of potentials for digitalization. There's also a lot of areas for friction and core limitations. Many digital projects prioritize storage rather than public access, limiting engagement. Digital archives are often ignore historical power imbalances, leaving cultural narratives underrepresented. Standardized processes often overlook the specific cultural needs for different communities, reducing the relevance of these collections. And the push to digitize quickly, frankly, leaves little room for thoughtful integration of new tools. As a result, the team that I work with, we saw 4 core limitations in the flexibility of current technologies that you're probably using right now in your own digital archives. First, high costs. and reliance on specialized centralized technology, this can make scalability, customization difficult. When we think about social participation, these centralized systems leave limited room for community involvement in shaping the documentation of their heritage. When it comes to context, it's difficult to capture these richer stories beyond basic metadata with current systems we use. And when it comes to automation, there is a clear need for thoughtful AI tools to improve and scale current translation, indexing, and contextualization. This brings us to our central question: how can the current tools we use for digitization afford us enough flexibility to explore cultural work in the manner we desire? And if we want to support diverse cultural expression and empower community engagement, how can we critically assess and adapt tools to meet our goals? So I want to share with you today, on that note, a case study on a platform called Tynacon and a bit about how it works with WordPress. So first, I don't know who here uses WordPress, but I'm going to preach about it for a second. At the heart of this experiment is WordPress. It's well known. It's already a socialized technology with many suppliers, consultants, technicians, available in order to reduce the technical dependence on a few suppliers and the high maintenance costs of technology for memory institutions. It allows multiple forms of web content publication, enabling the creation of dynamic web pages with varied designs, incorporating different types of media, and frankly being accessible as possible. It allows broad connectivity with social media platforms, open federated social networks, and in other words, it should enable different forms of network communication and collaboration. By being an open technology with easily accessible and well-known APIs, it can simplify and reduce the costs of connectivity with different artificial intelligence services. So I mentioned federated social networks. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but the idea of a Fediverse, in short, it's a decentralized network. You can control everything. Fediverses are not private networks controlled by private algorithms, but rather open source networks in which you can control all parts of the solution. So the algorithms you're using, the software you're using, etc. These are not your filter bubble algorithms. The concept of a federated social network is that you don't have to have just one instance of the service. Everyone can install it, everyone can use it, everyone can adapt it. Since 2023, WordPress has adopted something called ActivityPub. You're not required to use this, it's an option, but by using this, you can transform WordPress into an open federated social network. This can connect you to things like Mastodon, PeerTube, etc. This gets us to Tynacon. It's an open source, powerful, flexible repository for WordPress. Using this platform, you can create collections with custom metadata and filters, browse your items, manage taxonomies, consume data using a powerful API, and present stories using the Gutenberg blocks. So with Tynacon, this is developed at the University of Brasilia and was used as an experiment to say, okay, how can we connect these federated social networks to legacy databases? So in this case, you have your database, your digital collection, and you can use this API to connect to things like social media platforms, the existing Fediverse, or maybe, for example, one of the things I like, if you wanted to use the Wikimedia Commons with your work, rather than having to yourself reorganize how all your data, metadata is organized, Tynacon as an API can connect your legacy collection, reorganize the data, and spit it out on Wikimedia. Fun stuff. So one of the first tests we did with this, we really want to talk about decolonizing, an ethnographic database. This happened between the National Museums of World Culture in Sweden, University of Gothenburg, and University of Brasilia. So together they were really curious how to decolonize the Swedish museum database called Carlotta, focusing on indigenous artifacts, particularly from the YY people in the Brazilian Amazon, using Tynacon to enable new forms of digital representation and community involvement. The project aimed to address issues of categorization and historical biases in museum archives by incorporating indigenous perspectives, enabling more accurate and culturally relevant object descriptions, and enhancing indigenous voices as key stakeholders. The project's pilot phase, what's exciting, is it suggests that Tynacon can support crowd-funded, co-curated, and recategorized digital collections, allowing institutions to involve communities with practical tools designed for areas with limited internet connectivity and fostering broader adoption for similar decolonization efforts in cultural heritage. So again, what does this look like? So we have Carlotta, the system at the National Museum of World Cultures. They're sending their data to Kringla, which is the national aggregate of Sweden. This is also what sends data to Europeana. And then using a mix of Python, OpenRefine, Google Translate to take the text from Swedish to Portuguese. This was then sent via Tynecon to give you a sense of the workflow. To visualize this a bit more, on the left, I kind of joke, this is the basket that emerged. So we took what was on Carlotta. Here it is now on WordPress, suddenly available in Portuguese. Wahoo! Now, what was exciting from there is, as mentioned, difficult internet connectivity. So for the YY people, internet accessibility is not always the easiest. So we connected to WhatsApp, and they were able to receive these images, WhatsApp us data about it, and then also help us to build which objects am I most interested in having represented? How do I want them represented? And so on the right, you can see the WordPress environment that was built with the input of these people who maybe aren't physically close to the collection, but very much want input on their heritage. So, the conceptual model about thinking about decolonizing collections, we were so excited with Tynecon to think about the possibilities for contextual enrichment, how we can connect, again, these existing systems to things like dynamic translation, get you more connected to communities you may want to connect with around your collections, connect to social media networks, to use these low-cost, open-source items to, again, get more people connected. So to conclude, with my 30 seconds left, no more digital repositories. Let's think about open information ecosystems for cultural heritage. That is not my last page. Based on this case, I really urge you to start shifting your thinking away from a more siloed digital repository system and stop waiting on big tech to build us centralized systems. The tools exist now if you want to start building an information system that acts as a dynamic network, connecting and mapping cultural heritage circulation, restoring a museum's role as an articulator for cultural networks, facilitating systemization of different voices, making space for divergence and debate. Imagine an archive where you can have that multi-perspectivity of multiple viewpoints being held at once. How we can utilize AI to advance a more decolonized heritage practice and in fact reduce what I hope for a reliance on, again, these technological centralized suppliers. Thank you.
Yeah, can I invite you, thank you, Susannah, thank you, the three of you. Can I invite you to the podium and see if there's any questions? We have time for crew questions, maybe?
Good. I love your presentation.
Do I see hands up? Yes, there's lots of space. Do I see any hands for questions? Yes, Dieter, over there. Microphone is coming.
I just had a question with the AI generated and the crowd generated tags with the images. Can you give us some details on how you went about generating the AI generated part on that?
Can you say your name and your institution, please?
Okay. My name is Dieter Duite from Kent University.
Yeah, I don't have a very fun, sexy way of describing this. Besides, I went image by image and stuck it through the models, and then we copy and pasted out exactly what terms it gave us. So it took 2 months to run 1,091 images through 2 different AI models. For us, it was part of the project and we were prepared for that, but we lacked any kind of technical infrastructure to do anything more. And we really wanted our project to be something where what we were reporting out was a fairly low lift technologically for anybody who would want to try something similar. So yeah, it was just straight by hand.
Was it a captioning tool or was it
So the Google Cloud Vision API is just available on Google. You can upload your images in batches and it'll run the recognition and it spits out 5 different tags for free. I think if you want more, you have to pay. And we didn't have any money, so we took the 5. And then the Google Cloud Vision, the iMet Tagger was they had it on an open source platform, and similarly, you put your image file up, and it spit out 3 tags for each image.
Thank you.
Thank you. Axel, behind, here on the front, please.
Hello, I'm Axel from Berlin, Germany, Institute for Museum Research. In the beginning, we saw a slide that showed a text including not directly ruled by the British, but blah, blah, blah. Is it available what new text has been introduced to replace this?
I should have checked. You can look on Art and Artists and see it still. I think that work is still up there, but it's a different text now, I think. So those were, in a very short period of time, as I've been working on this project for 3 years, the texts, the work that was being done at Tate was going on at the same time. So they were changing things as fast as I could catch them.
It's an interesting example because it's quite difficult, quite subtle to find the right text there.
There are many like that, but we've only in the sector really dealt with the kind of words that you can spot. It's actually the tone and the slightly insidious white-centric colonialism that's more difficult to target. And it's also idiom quite often in our language, and it's why I said British colonialism, because I think I was talking to someone earlier, there are very specific Dutch idiom, terms and phrases and niggles and words and oddnesses as there are in British that you wouldn't necessarily think were pejorative, but are actually quite problematic.
And I see my clock is different than the time here, so we do have time for a couple more questions. Was there a hand there? George? Yeah, thank you.
George Brisker, Attack and Solutions. I wanted to ask again about those texts and texts that we find bias in. And I mean, ethical thought is always evolving. So, I mean, as a personal analogy, I get Facebook reminders of things that I said over the past 20 years or whenever Facebook started, and they're mostly cringeworthy. But at some point they might come around and they're not cringe again. So what I'm wondering is...
Project title that, tastes that are cringe.
So basically I'm just wondering, what is the thought around the preservation of those texts that we detect bias in now, and what should be done with them? Should they go away? Should they be stored in a certain way, or what is the thinking around that?
I think you don't erase them. I mean, we're museum people and archivists. We keep all the things and all the things about the things. I think that you deprioritize them. I do think titles, because titles change all the time, and there are lots of roles and contexts for titles. So I think those should, as the first piece of information, be adjusted to something that is perhaps descriptive rather than accurate, if the terminology is problematic. But I think that all of the interventions should be recognized as such, all the various versions of how we talk about that's art history. It's a historiography of how we've documented, so they do need preservation. I think the Smithsonian does it well at the Museum of African American Heritage. They have a whole kind of section of text and discussion about problematic archaic language, pejoratives, and they contextualize it so that you learn as you go why it might be not in use now. I think these things change, as you say. In another 5 years, we may have a different perspective, and what we're doing now will not be, I was thinking really doomy thoughts with the recent American election, might not be appropriate in the same way. So I think it's just recognition that there was a lovely word from Gisela, social documentation. That's what we do. That's the crux of it. Art is no less or more social than science is. These things are cyclical and interesting for that, or else we wouldn't have any historians. So yes, you keep it, you make some of it public, you think about appropriateness of audiences and what you are privileging and what you want to to not hide, but want to deprivilege. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for all the questions. Most of all, thank you for the speakers to inspire all these wonderful questions. And I think we're ready for the close-up. Saskia. Thank you.
Wow. Are you just as tired as I am? But also so inspired?